On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, a man named Harlan Dykstra drove his 1974 International Harvester 1066 tractor to a dealership in Platte County, Nebraska, and was told that the engine was beyond saving. The service manager, a man named Rick Thornton, walked Harlan around to the back of the building, pointed at the crack running along the left side of the block like a fault line through granite, and said the words that farm men in that county had been hearing with increasing frequency for the better part of a decade. He said, "You're looking at a boat anchor, Harlan. Best thing you can do is start shopping." Harlan was 58 years old. He had farmed the same 640 acres in Platte County for 31 years. His father had broken that ground before him, and his grandfather had broken ground 2 counties east before that. The 1066 had been on that farm for 14 years, had put in more hours than most men work in a lifetime, and Harlan Dykstra was not the kind of man who started shopping when something broke. He was the kind of man who fixed it. The problem was that nobody in Platte County, Nebraska, in the spring of 1987, could tell him how. Let me tell you about what cracked cylinder blocks meant to farmers in that part of the country, because you need to understand the problem before you can understand the man who spent the next 25 years solving it for everyone else. A cracked engine block is not a small problem. It is not a gasket you swap on a Saturday afternoon, or a belt you order from the back of a farm supply catalog. A cracked block is a structural failure in the heart of the machine. The iron casting that holds the cylinders, the coolant passages, the oil galleries, the entire geometry of the engine together in one rigid piece. When that casting develops a crack, coolant migrates into the oil migrates into the coolant, combustion pressure bleeds into passages it was never meant to reach, and the engine begins to destroy itself from the inside with quiet efficiency. In a warm climate, a cracked block might give you months of warning. In Nebraska, where temperatures swung from 105 degrees in August to 20 below in January, where engines were started cold and run hard and parked hot and left in unheated machine sheds through winters that would crack concrete, a block could fail fast and it could fail completely. And when it did, the options in 1987 were limited and expensive. You could buy a remanufactured long block from a dealer for a price that would make a farmer's stomach drop. You could hunt the salvage yards for a used block and gamble on its condition. Or you could take it to a machine shop and hope someone there had the equipment and the knowledge to repair the casting itself, which in Platte County meant driving to Omaha or Lincoln and paying city prices and waiting weeks for a machine shop that had more work than it could handle to get around to your tractor. Rick Thornton had told Harlan to start shopping, and Rick Thornton was not entirely wrong. That was the part that made it hard. Harlan drove the 1066 home on a borrowed trailer that afternoon, parked it beside the machine shed, and stood looking at it for a long time. Then he drove to the county library in Columbus and spent the better part of 2 days reading everything he could find about cast iron metallurgy, crack repair methods, and the history of engine block restoration. He was not an engineer. He had a high school diploma and 31 years of practical experience. But Harlan Dykstra was the kind of man who believed that if a thing had been built, it could be understood, and if it could be understood, it could be fixed. He came home from the library with a notebook full of handwritten notes and a name he had found in a trade publication. A process called metal stitching, developed for industrial repair of large iron castings, used in mining and marine applications, largely unknown in agricultural repair. The principle was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of welding the crack, which required extreme heat that could warp the casting and often made the crack propagate further, metal stitching used a series of interlocking metal inserts, threaded plugs, and locking keys made of a nickel-iron alloy, driven cold into the casting along the length of the crack. No heat, no distortion. The crack was mechanically locked from the inside, the casting restored to its original geometry, the repair invisible from the outside and stronger, in some ways, than the original iron. Harlan ordered the tool in from a supplier in Pennsylvania. It cost him $340, which was not nothing in 1987. He practiced the technique on a scrap block from the salvage yard for 3 weeks before he touched his 1066. Then he repaired his own engine, reinstalled it, started it on a cold April morning, and listened to it run. It ran clean. It ran quiet. It ran exactly as it had before the crack. He put it back to work that spring, and it never gave him trouble again. Let me tell you about what happened after that, because the story of Harlan Dykstra does not begin with the repair of his own tractor. That is only the beginning of the beginning. Word travels in a county the way weather travels, which is to say it moves whether you want it to or not, and it reaches everyone eventually. By the end of that first summer, 2 of Harlan's neighbors had heard what he had done and asked if he could look at their blocks. One was a cracked head on a John Deere 4020. The other was a block crack on an Oliver 1850 that a salvage yard had written off as scrap. Harlan looked at both of them, assessed the cracks, and repaired them in the machine shed behind his house. He charged his neighbors for the cost of the inserts and the time it took him, which was less than half what a machine shop in Lincoln would have charged and a fraction of the cost of a replacement block. Both engines ran. Both farmers went back to work. And both farmers, being the kind of men they were, told other farmers what Harlan had done. By 1989, Harlan had repaired blocks for 11 different farms in Platte County. By 1991, he had built a proper workshop on the back corner of his property, a 40 by 60 cinder block building with a concrete floor, a 2-ton overhead crane, a parts washer, a hydraulic press, and 3 workbenches that were always occupied. He had taken a second course in metal stitching from the tooling supplier, this time a hands-on clinic in Pennsylvania that he drove to in his pickup and attended alongside marine engineers and industrial maintenance men who were surprised to find a Nebraska farmer in the room. He came home with a certificate and a new set of tooling and the quiet confidence of a man who has learned a thing properly and knows it. He was still farming his 640 acres. The repair work was something he did in the evenings and on weekends, and in the slow weeks of late winter when the fields were frozen and there was nothing to do but wait for spring. He was not trying to build a business. He was trying to solve a problem that nobody else in his county was solving. Let me tell you about the lot, because the lot is where this story lives. By 1993, Harlan had accumulated a problem that was also an opportunity. Farmers were bringing him blocks that were too far gone for immediate repair, or blocks they had pulled from machines they weren't sure were worth fixing, or blocks they had carried in the beds of their pickups for months, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. They would pull up to Harlan's workshop, unload the block with the rented engine hoist or the bucket of a front loader, set it on the gravel beside the building, and say some version of the same thing. "I'll come back for it when I know what I want to do." Some of them came back in a week. Some came back in a month. Some, Harlan understood, might not come back for a long time, because the decision of whether to repair an old tractor or replace it is not a decision a farmer makes quickly, especially when money is tight and the farm is busy and the machine in question is one he has been putting off dealing with for years. Harlan did not chase them. He did not send invoices for storage. He set the blocks along the fence line at the east side of his property, organized by engine type and farm of origin, tagged with a strip of aluminum flashing, stamped with the owner's name and the date of arrival. And he waited. The lot, as it came to be known in Platte County, was not a junkyard. It was a waiting room. It was a place where broken things were held in trust until their owners were ready to decide what came next. By 1995, there were 34 blocks on that lot. By 1998, there were more than 60. By 2003, the number had grown past 80, representing farms from 4 counties and engine families spanning 6 decades of American agricultural manufacturing. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever driven past a place like that and seen it the way most people see it? A field of rusting iron beside a cinder block building on a gravel road in Nebraska, blocks stacked on wooden pallets, some of them green with age, some of them black with oil, some of them cracked so badly you could see daylight through the casting. Most people who drove past Harlan Dykstra's lot saw a collection of junk. They saw the physical residue of mechanical failure, the iron graveyard of machines that hadn't been fast enough or strong enough or modern enough to survive. They saw the past. Harlan Dykstra saw something different. He saw a record. He saw 80-some engines representing 80-some farms and 80-some decisions that hadn't been made yet, and he understood that his job was to be there when those decisions were finally made. He was 68 years old by 2003. He had been farming and repairing for 47 years. He had the patience of a man who has watched crops grow and understood that most important things happen slowly. Let me tell you about Rick Thornton, because Rick Thornton is part of this story whether he wanted to be or not. Rick Thornton had been the service manager at the International Harvester dealership in Columbus when he told Harlan to start shopping in 1987. By 1993, he had left that dealership and opened his own operation, a farm equipment sales and service center on Highway 30 east of Columbus that carried a mix of used equipment and did warranty work for 2 regional lines. Rick was good at his job. He understood equipment, he understood farmers, and he understood the economics of a service department, which meant he understood that some repairs were worth doing and some were not. A cracked block on a 20-year-old tractor was, in Rick Thornton's professional assessment, not worth doing. The labor hours were unpredictable, the liability if the repair failed was real, and the market for a repaired old tractor was thin enough that the math rarely worked in anyone's favor. Rick had made this calculation hundreds of times, and he was not wrong about the math. What he was wrong about was the farmer. The first time Rick Thornton and Harlan Dykstra crossed paths after 1987 was at the Platte County Farm Bureau meeting in the spring of 1994. Harlan had been invited to say a few words about the block repair work he was doing at the request of the county extension agent, who had been fielding questions about it from farmers across the region. Harlan stood up in the meeting room at the Columbus Fairgrounds and spent about 10 minutes describing the metal stitching process in plain language. What it was, how it worked, what it could and could not fix, and what it cost compared to the alternatives. He was not a natural public speaker. He spoke the way he worked, which was methodically and without flourish, covering each point in order and stopping when he had said what needed to be said. When he sat down, there were questions from the floor, and most of them were from farmers who had been told by one dealer or another that their blocks were boat anchors. Rick Thornton was sitting 3 rows back. He had not known Harlan would be speaking. He listened to the questions and the answers, and when the meeting broke up and the farmers were filing out, he walked over to where Harlan was talking to the extension agent and waited until the conversation finished. Then he said, loud enough for the people nearby to hear, "Harlan, I've seen these stitching repairs. They don't hold. You put a repaired block under load and you're going to have that farmer back in your yard inside of a season." Harlan looked at him for a moment. He said, "Which ones have you seen fail, Rick?" Rick said he had read about failures in trade publications. Harlan said he had repaired 47 blocks in the past 7 years and had not had one come back to him with a repair failure. Rick said that was a small sample. Harlan said it was 47 more than Rick had. The room had gotten quiet. Rick Thornton's smile was still there, but it had gotten smaller. He said, "I'd hate to see you make promises you can't keep to these people." Harlan said, "I appreciate that, Rick. I'll keep making the repairs and you can keep sending people to Omaha." Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the years that followed are where the weight of this story accumulates. Between 1994 and 2008, Harlan Dykstra repaired somewhere between 340 and 360 cracked cylinder blocks. He kept a ledger, a green accounting book he bought at the office supply store in Columbus, and every repair was recorded in it. The owner's name, the engine family, the nature and location of the crack, the repair method, the date completed, and the outcome at follow-up. He followed up on every repair. He called the farmer 6 months out, then a year out, then every 2 years after that. The ledger showed 3 repairs that had required rework, all of them in the first 4 years before he had fully refined his technique, all of them corrected at no charge to the farmer, all of them ultimately successful. The ledger showed 0 field failures, 0 engines that had cracked again at the repair site, 0 farmers who had gone back to the dealer and been told the block was gone. He repaired Farmall blocks and Deere blocks and Oliver blocks and Minneapolis Moline blocks and Alice Chalmers blocks and White blocks and Ford blocks and Case blocks and H blocks going back to the 1940s. He repaired blocks that machine shops in Omaha had turned away. He repaired blocks that had been written off as scrap by 3 different people before they reached his lot. He repaired a 1952 Farmall M block that had a crack running 11 inches along the water jacket, a crack so severe that the previous owner had filled it with epoxy and painted over it and sold the tractor to a man in Colfax County who drove it to Harlan's lot on a flatbed with coolant, weeping from the painted-over repair. Harlan spent 2 days on that block. When he was done, you could not find the crack with a magnifying glass. The farmer drove the M back to Colfax County and ran it for another 9 years. The lot never emptied. Farmers brought blocks faster than Harlan could repair them, and some blocks sat for years because the owners were still deciding, and some sat because the owners had died and the farm had passed to children who weren't sure what they wanted to do with the old equipment. And some sat because Harlan had assessed them and told the owner honestly that the crack was in a location he couldn't reach with his tooling and the block was not repairable by his method. Those last ones he kept anyway, because occasionally a farmer would come looking for a specific engine family for a parts machine, and Harlan's lot was the most comprehensive inventory of agricultural iron castings in 4 counties. He never advertised. He never put up a sign. The lot was known because the farmers who had used it told other farmers, and in Platte County, Nebraska, that was the only advertising that had ever mattered. Rick Thornton's dealership on Highway 30 did well through the late 1990s and into the 2000s. The farm economy was uneven, but not catastrophic in that period, and there was enough equipment moving and enough service work to keep a well-run shop busy. Rick had expanded twice, added a second service bay, brought on a younger mechanic named Jason, who was good with the newer computer-controlled systems that were showing up on equipment by the early 2000s. Rick had also, over the years, developed a habit of mentioning Harlan Dykstra's repair work and conversations with customers in a way that was not exactly disparagement and not exactly endorsement, but occupied the careful middle ground of professional skepticism. He would say things like, "You could try the stitching repair, I suppose, if you want to go that route," in a tone that made clear what he thought of that route. He would say, "Some of those old repairs hold and some don't. It really depends on the crack in the operator," which was technically true and functionally discouraging. He was not malicious about it. He was a businessman protecting his business, which included selling replacement engines and remanufactured long blocks at margins that kept his lights on. Harlan Dykstra's repair service was not Rick Thornton's competition in any direct commercial sense, but it was competition in the sense that every block Harlan repaired was a block that didn't get replaced, and replacement was where the margin lived. Let me tell you about 2008, because 2008 is when the first of the two things happened that changed everything. The farm economy in 2008 was complicated. Commodity prices were high, which was good, but input costs had risen with them, and the financial crisis in the fall of that year sent a wave of uncertainty through agricultural lending that made farmers cautious in ways they hadn't been in years. Equipment purchases slowed. Farmers who had been thinking about trading up held off. Farmers who had been putting off repairs decided to repair. The phone at Harlan's workshop rang more in the fall of 2008 than it had in any previous fall, and the lot filled up faster than it had since the mid-1990s. Harlan was 79 years old. He was still farming, though his son Dale had taken over most of the field work by then. He was still repairing, though he worked more slowly now and took more breaks, and sometimes had to ask Dale to help him maneuver the heavier blocks onto the workbench. He had repaired, by his own count, somewhere north of 400 blocks by the end of 2008. He had never had a field failure. He had never had a farmer come back to him and say the repair had let go under load. He had never once told a farmer his block was a boat anchor when it wasn't. Rick Thornton's dealership on Highway 30 closed in the spring of 2009. The financial crisis had tightened credit, equipment sales had fallen sharply, and Rick had made some inventory decisions in 2007 and 2008 that looked reasonable at the time and looked less reasonable in hindsight. The closing was not a scandal. It was the kind of quiet business failure that happens when the margin disappears and the debt doesn't. Rick sold the building and the equipment, paid what he could, and moved to a sales position with a regional equipment distributor based in Grand Island. He was 61 years old. He was not ruined. He was diminished. And in a county where a man's business was a significant part of his identity, diminishment was its own kind of loss. Harlan Dykstra heard about the closing from Dale, who had heard it at the grain elevator. He did not say anything about it. He went out to the workshop that evening and worked on a Deere 4230 block that had been on the lot since 2006, a crack along the main bearing web that required a specific sequence of inserts he had been refining his approach to. He worked until it was too dark to see clearly. then went inside and wrote up the repair in the ledger. Let me tell you about the Foundry, because the Foundry is where this story turns. The Foundry, that had been casting agricultural engine blocks for the major manufacturers in that region of the country, was not one foundry. It was several, and they had been consolidating and closing for decades. But the one that mattered most to the farmers of Platte County and the surrounding counties was a gray iron casting operation in a city 90 miles to the east that had been producing replacement blocks and heads for agricultural engines since the 1950s. It was not a famous place. It was not the kind of operation that appeared in trade publications or sent representatives to farm shows. It was the kind of operation that existed in the industrial background of American agriculture. The place that made the parts, that made the machines, that made the food, invisible until it was gone. It had survived the consolidation waves of the 1980s and 1990s by being efficient and by serving a market that the larger casting operations considered too fragmented and too low volume to bother with. The replacement parts market for older agricultural engines, the engines that the major manufacturers had stopped supporting, the engines that lived on in the machine sheds of farms across the Midwest, because the farmers who owned them refused to let them die. The Foundry closed in the spring of 2012. The announcement came in February, a 2-paragraph notice in a trade publication that most farmers never read, and it said that operations would cease on April 15th and that orders placed before March 1st would be fulfilled. It said nothing about what would happen to the tooling, the patterns, the institutional knowledge that had accumulated over 60 years of casting agricultural iron. Those things, the announcement implied without saying, would be liquidated or scrapped. Let me tell you about what that closure meant, because it takes a moment to understand the full weight of it. For farmers in Platte County and the surrounding region, the Foundry closure meant that the supply of new replacement blocks for certain engine families was now gone. Not reduced. Gone. The engines in question were not antiques. They were working machines, tractors and combines and stationary engines that were still in daily use on farms across the Midwest. Engines from the 1960s and 1970s and early 1980s that had been well built enough to last half a century with proper maintenance, but that were now suddenly operating without a safety net. If your block cracked after April 2012, you could not buy a new replacement. You could hunt the salvage yards, which were finite and growing more finite every year. You could try to find a used block in good condition, which was increasingly difficult. Or you could repair what you had. The closure did not create Harlan Dijkstra's business, but it revealed it. It revealed that for 25 years, while the supply chain that everyone assumed would always be there was slowly dying, one man in Platte County, Nebraska, had been building the only alternative that actually worked. The phone at Harlan's workshop started ringing in March of 2012 and did not stop. Farmers who had never heard of metal stitching called because their neighbors had told them to call. Farmers from counties Harlan had never worked in called because the Extension Service had given them his number. A farmer from western Iowa called. A farmer from South Dakota called. A retired implement dealer from Missouri called, not for himself, but because he had 4 customers who needed help and he wanted to understand what Harlan could do before he sent them his way. Harlan talked to all of them. He was 83 years old. His hands shook slightly when he wasn't working, but when he was working, they were steady. Dale had taken over the farm entirely by then, and Harlan's days were the workshop and the ledger and the lot, which had grown to hold more than 120 blocks by the time the foundry closed. Let me tell you about the spring of 2012, because the spring of 2012 is the season this story has been building toward since 1987. It was in April of that year, 2 weeks after the foundry officially closed, that Rick Thornton drove his truck down the gravel road to Harlan Dykstra's property and parked in the gravel beside the lot. He was driving a newer truck than the one Harlan remembered from the Farm Bureau meeting in 1994. But he was wearing the same kind of clothes, a clean collared shirt and pressed jeans, the clothes of a man who works indoors and wants you to know it. He walked around to the workshop where Harlan was at the bench working on a Farmall 560 block, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before Harlan looked up. Harlan looked at him the way a man looks at someone he has not seen in a long time and has not been waiting for. He said, "Rick." Rick said, "Harlan." He came inside and looked at the workshop, at the crane and the press and the bench, and the organized rows of tooling and the green ledger sitting open on the corner of the bench, and he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I've got 3 customers who need blocks I can't source anymore. The foundry's gone. I've been calling around and there's nothing available for 2 of the engine families. I was wondering if you could help them out." Harlan set down the insert driver he was holding. He looked at Rick Thornton for a long moment. He said, "You told me in 1994 that these repairs don't hold." Rick said, "I know what I said." Harlan said, "You've been telling farmers for 18 years that they ought to think twice before they came out here." Rick said, "I know that too." Harlan said, "How many of those farmers did you send to Omaha for a replacement block?" Rick didn't answer that. Harlan said, "Send me your 3 customers, Rick. I'll take care of them." He picked up the insert driver and went back to work. Rick Thornton stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Harlan," and walked back to his truck. Now, let me pause here and ask you something, because this moment is one that people get wrong when they tell this story. They want it to be a triumph. They want Harlan to have savored it, to have let Rick Thornton stand there and feel the full weight of 18 years of professional dismissal before offering a grudging and conditional forgiveness. That is the version of the story that feels satisfying in the way that revenge feels satisfying. But that is not who Harlan Dykstra was. Harlan Dykstra was not a man who collected grievances. He was a man who repaired things. He had been repairing things for 25 years, and the most important thing he had learned in those 25 years was that a crack does not care who caused it or why. It only cares whether you have the patience and the knowledge to close it. He sent Rick Thornton's 3 customers a fair price. He repaired their blocks. He wrote them up in the ledger. He followed up 6 months later, and then a year later, and all 3 engines ran clean. Let me tell you about the lot in the summer of 2012, because by that summer the lot had become something that Platte County had not quite seen before. Farmers who had been sitting on cracked blocks for years, waiting for the replacement supply to come back, understanding now that it was not coming back, began arriving at Harlan's property in numbers that surprised even Dale, who had grown up watching his father's reputation build slowly across 2 decades. They came in pickups with blocks in the bed. They came on trailers. One man came with a cracked head balanced on a moving blanket in the back of a minivan, which made Dale laugh and made Harlan ask whether the man had tied it down properly. The lot expanded. Harlan had Dale build a second row of pallet racks along the north fence, and then a third row, and by the end of the summer the lot held more than 180 blocks representing farms from 7 counties and 3 states. Every block was tagged with the aluminum flashing strip. Every block was entered in a secondary ledger that Harlan kept for the lot, distinct from the repair ledger, recording the owner, the engine family, the condition on arrival, and the date. He had been keeping this record since 1993. It was, by 2012, the most complete informal registry of cracked agricultural iron castings in the region, possibly in the country. Nobody had planned it that way. It had grown the way Harlan's reputation had grown, which was one block at a time, one repaired engine at a time, one farmer who told another farmer at a time. The repairs that summer were not all straightforward. The Foundry closure had changed the nature of the work in a specific way. Before the closure, farmers had options, and the blocks that came to Harlan were the ones the other options couldn't handle. After the closure, there were no other options, and the blocks that came to Harlan included some that were at the outer edge of what metal stitching could address. Cracks in locations that were difficult to access. Cracks in thin-walled sections where the insert placement required a precision that left almost no margin for error. Cracks that had been previously repaired with epoxy or brazing or welding and had failed, leaving the casting compromised in ways that complicated the stitching approach. Harlan turned none of them away without a thorough assessment. He turned some away after the assessment, telling the farmer honestly that the crack was beyond what he could repair reliably, and in those cases he would often help the farmer identify a suitable used block from his lot inventory or from salvage yards he had relationships with in 3 states. He had built those relationships over 25 years of calling salvage yards looking for specific engine families for his customers, and by 2012 he was the first call those yards made when an agricultural block came in, because Harlan could tell them within 10 minutes whether the casting was sound and what it was worth. Let me tell you about Harlan's hands, because his hands are part of this story in a way that is hard to explain but important to try. A man who has worked with iron for 25 years develops a relationship with the material that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. Cast iron is not a uniform material. It has grain and density variations that result from the cooling process in the mold, and those variations affect how a crack propagates and how a repair insert seats and holds. An experienced metal stitching technician develops a feel for the material through the tools, through the resistance of the drill bit entering the casting, through the way the tap cuts the threads for the insert, through the sound the insert makes when it is driven home. Harlan Dykstra had been developing that feel since 1987. By 2012, he had 25 years of it in his hands, and it was not a thing that could be learned from a manual or a certification course. It was knowledge that lived in the body, the kind of knowledge that the 20th century had been systematically devaluing in favor of knowledge that could be written down and standardized and reproduced by anyone with the right training. Harlan's knowledge could not be standardized. It could be passed on, but only by demonstration, only by standing beside someone and letting them feel through the tool what you had learned to feel. And that kind of transmission was slow and personal and inefficient by every measure except the one that mattered, which was whether the repair held. Dale had been learning from his father since he was a teenager. By 2012, he was 47 years old and had been doing repairs alongside Harlan for more than 20 years. He was not as fast as Harlan had been at his peak, and he was not yet as precise, but he was close, and he was getting better, and Harlan knew that the knowledge was transferring the way it was supposed to transfer, which was through the hands and not through a textbook. There was a young man from Platte County, a farmer's son named Ethan Peterson, who was 24 years old and had started coming around the workshop in 2011 after his father's block had been repaired there, who was also learning. He had good hands and a patient temperament and a willingness to watch and ask questions rather than assume he understood before he did. Harlan liked him. He let him work on scrap blocks under supervision, the same way Harlan had taught himself in 1987, and by the summer of 2012, Ethan was doing straightforward repairs on his own, while Harlan watched and corrected. The knowledge was moving forward. That was what mattered. Let me tell you about the afternoon in September of 2012, when a reporter from the Columbus Telegram drove out to Harlan's property, because that afternoon is the moment when Platte County's private knowledge became public record. The reporter was a young woman named Claire Gustafson, who covered agriculture and rural business for the paper. She had heard about Harlan's lot from the county extension agent, who had been fielding calls about block repair from across the region since the Foundry closure, and had finally suggested that the story was worth telling. Claire Gustafson drove out on a Tuesday afternoon and found Harlan in the workshop and spent 3 hours with him, asking questions and writing in a notebook and photographing the lot and the workshop and the ledger. Harlan answered her questions the way he answered all questions, which was directly and without embellishment, and he showed her the ledger and the lot records and let her photograph the pages. The numbers were in the ledger. More than 400 repairs over 25 years. 0 field failures at the repair site. Farmers from 7 counties. Blocks representing engine families that the manufacturers had stopped supporting decades ago. All of it written in Harlan's careful hand in the green accounting books he had been buying at the office supply store in Columbus since 1987. The story ran on the front page of the Telegram the following Sunday. It was picked up by the Lincoln Journal-Star the week after that, and then by the Omaha World Herald, and then by a farm publication based in Des Moines that had a national readership. The phone at Harlan's workshop rang from states he had never worked in. A man from Minnesota called. A man from Kansas called. A retired agricultural engineer from Ohio called and said he had been following the metal stitching technique in industrial applications for 30 years and had never heard of anyone applying it systematically to agricultural engines at this scale, and asked if he could come visit. Harlan said yes to the Ohio engineer and most of the others. He was 83 years old, and he was not interested in fame, but he understood that the Foundry closure had created a problem that was larger than Platte County, and that the knowledge he had built over 25 years was the most complete practical answer to that problem that existed, and that keeping it to himself now would be a different kind of failure than the ones he had spent his career preventing. Let me tell you about the winter of 2012 and 2013, because that winter is when Harlan Dykstra did the thing that may have mattered most of all. He dictated. Dale sat beside him at the kitchen table with a laptop computer, which was not a thing Harlan used himself, and Harlan talked and Dale typed. They worked 3 evenings a week from November through March, and what they produced was a document of 140 pages that described, in Harlan's plain and methodical language, everything he knew about the repair of cracked agricultural iron castings. It covered the assessment of cracks, the identification of crack types and locations, the selection of repair methods, the specific techniques for metal stitching in each of the major engine families he had worked on, the common failure modes and how to avoid them, the tools and their maintenance, the sourcing of materials, and the follow-up protocol he had developed over 25 years of calling farmers back to check on their engines. It covered the things that could not be done and why, the cracks that were beyond repair and how to recognize them, the situations where a used block was a better answer than a repair and how to find one. It was not a polished document. It was not formatted for publication. It was a working document, the kind of thing you put on the bench beside you and consult while you work, and it was written in the voice of a man who had done the work himself and wanted to make sure the person reading it could do it too. Harlan sent copies to Dale, to Ethan Peterson, to the Ohio engineer, to the County Extension Service, and to the agricultural program at a community college in Columbus that had expressed interest in incorporating the technique into their equipment maintenance curriculum. He did not copyright it. He did not charge for it. He said, when Dale asked him about that the knowledge had not cost him anything except time and attention, and that it would not do anyone any good sitting in a drawer. Let me tell you about the last thing Rick Thornton said to Harlan Dykstra, because it is the last thing in this story that needs to be said about Rick Thornton. It was at the Platte County Farm Bureau annual meeting in the spring of 2013, the same organization where Rick had dismissed Harlan's work 19 years earlier. Harlan had been asked to speak again, this time not for 10 minutes but for the full program, and he'd brought the 140-page document and copies of the ledger pages and a cracked block on a cart so he could demonstrate the technique. He spoke for 45 minutes. When he finished, the room gave him a standing ovation, which was not a thing that happened often at Farm Bureau meetings in Platte County. Rick Thornton was in the back row. He had come, he told someone later, because he felt he owed it to Harlan to be there. When the applause died down and the farmers were moving toward the coffee table, Rick made his way to the front of the room where Harlan was packing up his demonstration materials. He waited until the crowd around Harlan thinned, and then he said, "I told you in 1994 these repairs don't hold." Harlan said, "I remember." Rick said, "I was wrong." Harlan looked at him for a moment. He said, "The repairs hold, Rick. They always held. The question was whether people believed they would." Rick nodded. He said, "I should have sent you customers instead of sending them to Omaha." Harlan said, "Some of them found me anyway." Rick said, "Not all of them." Harlan said, "No, not all of them.